Lee Choon-jae is a name that resonates with terror in South Korean history. As the perpetrator behind the Hwaseong serial murders, Lee haunted a nation for years, before evading justice for decades. His tale is one of horror, failure, and, ultimately, closure, as a seemingly unremarkable man led a double life as one of the country's most prolific serial killers. The story of Lee Choon-jae unfolds across a timeline of tragic events, botched investigations, and a chilling confession decades later. Here is a detailed 20-minute account of his dark journey. It was the quiet rural town of Hwaseong in Gyeonggi Province, South Korea, that would soon become the center of one of the most chilling crime sprees in the country's history. On September 15, 1986, a woman in her 70s was found dead in a rice field. She had been raped, strangled with her own stockings, and left exposed, a grotesque display of violence in a place where such things were nearly unimaginable. This was only the beginning. Over the next few months, more women, ranging in age from teenagers to elderly grandmothers, would be found murdered in similarly brutal ways. The killer had a consistent method, stalking his victims, raping them, and then strangling them with their own clothes or other items. He would often leave the bodies positioned in disturbing ways, as if to mock the very idea of safety in the town. The Hwaseong police, overwhelmed by the sudden spate of murders, were desperate to solve the case. They mobilized a massive task force, with thousands of officers scouring the area, interviewing witnesses, and conducting stakeouts. Despite their best efforts, they struggled to find any solid leads. The killer seemed to vanish as easily as he struck, leaving behind nothing but fear and unanswered questions. By 1988, the killer's attacks had become more brazen, more methodical, and, if possible, more terrifying. He was striking with alarming frequency, sometimes within weeks of his previous murders. The randomness of his targets, women from all walks of life and ages, fueled widespread panic. Hwaseong's once peaceful roads became places of dread after sunset. Families forbade their daughters from going out alone, and people lived in constant fear. The killer's tactics were both chilling and meticulous. He would meticulously stalk his victims, often breaking into their homes ahead of time to scout the environment and prepare for the attack. On the night of a murder, he would strike quickly and with ruthless efficiency. There were reports that he deliberately chose rainy nights, knowing that the sound of raindrops and muddy roads would hinder pursuit and dampen any noise he made. During this period, the police interviewed more than 21,000 potential suspects, and collected 40,000 sets of fingerprints. They even deployed cutting-edge technology for the time, including polygraphs and hypnosis, to generate leads. However, the investigation soon became notorious for its mismanagement. Crucial evidence was mishandled, and lines of inquiry were abandoned prematurely. The killer, meanwhile, seemed to be taunting the authorities with his ability to evade capture. One of the most tragic elements of this case was the wrongful conviction of Yoon Sang-yeo, a young man with an intellectual disability who was accused of the murder of a 13-year-old girl, one of the serial killer's victims. Yoon was coerced into confessing after hours of brutal interrogation. The police, eager to claim progress in the case, declared him guilty and sentenced him to life in prison. While Yoon languished in jail, the real killer continued his spree. Yoon's conviction was emblematic of the broader failures in the investigation. Desperation and public pressure led the authorities to grasp at any semblance of a breakthrough, no matter how flimsy. The wrongful imprisonment of Yoon would haunt South Korea for decades and serve as a grim reminder of the dangers of flawed justice. After the murder of a 69-year-old woman in 1991, the killing suddenly stopped. The Hwaseong serial murders, which had claimed the lives of 10 women over 5 years, went cold. The sudden cessation of the crimes puzzled investigators. In the absence of new murders, the case gradually slipped from public attention. For the families of the victims, however, the pain never faded. The trauma of the murders lingered in Hwaseong, a ghost of a nightmare that still haunted the town. The authorities, despite closing the active investigation, never gave up entirely, but they lacked the technological tools to make any real progress. Unbeknownst to them, the killer had been living a relatively ordinary life. Lee Choon-jae, the man responsible for so much death and horror, had married, fathered a child, and maintained a low profile. He had been arrested in 1993 for the rape and murder of his sister-in-law, a crime that, chillingly, mirrored the Hwaseong murders. He was sentenced to life in prison for that crime, but his connection to the serial killings remained undetected. The breakthrough in the Hwaseong case came in 2019, more than 30 years after the first murder. Advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to reanalyze evidence from the crime scenes. Samples from multiple murders were found to match a single suspect, Lee Choon-jae, who was already serving a life sentence for his sister-in-law's murder. When confronted with the evidence, Lee initially denied everything. However, as more pressure was applied, he eventually confessed. In a chillingly calm manner, Lee described his crimes in detail. He admitted to the murder of 14 people, including the 10 women from the Hwaseong murders. He also claimed responsibility for additional sexual assaults and crimes that had never been connected to him. What shocked investigators was not just his willingness to confess, but the complete lack of remorse he displayed. Lee seemed to revel in recounting the horror he inflicted. He described how he had selected his victims, meticulously planned his attacks, and how he enjoyed the power he held over his terrified prey. His confession also revealed that he had never been seriously concerned about getting caught. He knew the limitations of forensic technology at the time and exploited them to stay ahead of the law. Lee's confession sent shockwaves through South Korea. The Hwaseong serial murders had been a national trauma, and the resolution of the case brought a mix of relief, anger, and sorrow. Families of the victims, who had spent decades waiting for answers, now faced the grim truth. For many, the knowledge that Lee had been living freely for years while they mourned was a bitter pill to swallow. The case also forced a national reckoning with the failures of the initial investigation. The wrongful conviction of Yoon Sang-yeol became a focal point of the conversation, highlighting the need for justice reform and better investigative practices. In 2020, Yoon was exonerated, but the years lost in prison could never be returned to him. His wrongful imprisonment remains one of the darkest stains on South Korea's legal history. The Hwaseong murders have since become a case study in criminology and forensic science. They underscored the importance of preserving evidence, the dangers of rushing to judgment, and the need for continuous improvement in investigative methods. The case also led to legislative changes, including the removal of the statute of limitations for certain serious crimes, ensuring that even years later, justice can still be served.